time to go on the record with WRAL News.
Hi everyone, I'm Cullen Browder and welcome to On the Record. If I mention General Assembly and your eyes gloss over, consider this. Our state lawmakers hold power over our taxes, our health care, the right to vote, to carry guns, and protect our families from those guns. Their decisions impact all of us, so tonight we're tapping into WRAL's NC Capitol team to bring us up to speed on what our state senators and representatives are doing this session. Joining me in this first segment, WRAL's Capitol Bureau Chief Laura Leslie, State Government reporter Travis Fain to help us break down a litany of issues under consideration. So Laura, let's start with you. A local bill was voted out of committee this week that would change the way Wake County votes on the Wake County commissioners.
Right.
Last election, Wake County voted in all Democrats. Republicans want to change how we vote. Explain what's happening.
Right. Well, this has been sort of a long time coming because we've had a lot of growth in Wake County. A lot of it's been from the West Coast, from other areas that are more politically liberal. And Wake County has gotten more blue over time. And there hasn't been a Republican on the County Commissioners board since 2014. It's been a long time. So Republicans want to, instead of electing commissioners from all county, like right now, you and I can each vote for all 7 commissioners, right? We have one district that we live in, but we get to vote for all 7. What this would do is say, you get to vote for the one that represents your district. You don't get to vote for any of the rest of them. So that would, they say, be fairer, be closer to the people, and get the districts more attention than maybe they get now, because they feel like Raleigh as the city and then Cary, the 2 big metropolitan centers of the county, they make up 55% of the population, and the folks in the rural areas, they say, don't feel like they have their voices heard.
So how does this compare to other counties, school boards, and even how our state lawmakers are elected?
Well, okay, for one thing, it would be redrawing their boundaries without their permission, which normally they try not to do, but sometimes they do. Okay, so all the state's biggest counties, urban counties, are districted commissions. Wake is not. However, the majority of the counties around the state overall are at large votes, right? So that's Wake can say, right, this is how we do it, this is how everybody else does it, right? But there's another twist to this, and that is that these races would be nonpartisan. So what that could mean is that you would have and plurality. So no runoffs, no primaries. So you could end up with a field of like 20 people, and somebody could win on 5% of the vote. Right there. And so that's what the county commissioners that I've spoken to say that they're most concerned with. They feel like having the primary process and partisan primary allows the candidates to be more vetted and to win more public support than a nonpartisan.
And not surprisingly, the county commission leadership in Wake County is against this, but also the County Commissioners Association is against this. It really boils down to how you interpret fairness, Travis?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, you think about a county like Wake County, if you do it countywide, then the majority party is likely to win all the seats, right? If you break it up into the districts, then you're likely to have a little bit more diverse, for lack of a better phrase, representation on the county board. So you can see where the Republicans are coming from here, and then the Democrats are saying, well, wait a minute, you didn't really discuss this with us. You're just moving forward with it.
So what's the status of the bill right now?
Well, it is moving, and Erin Perret is the sponsor. She is the only Republican in the Wake delegation. Excuse me, the rest of the Wake delegation does not support this bill, but it seems likely to move forward.
So let's shift to some healthcare issues. We talk a lot about Medicaid expansion. Travis, just explain briefly for everyone, what exactly are we talking about expanding Medicaid?
All right, so Medicaid obviously it helps people who make very little money, children, disabled people, the elderly. And when I say very little money, I mean very, very, very little money. So expansion would boost this taxpayer healthcare program to help the working poor primarily, adults who have a job but don't make enough to afford health insurance on their own. It's hundreds of thousands of people in North Carolina, and we've been back and forth on this. I mean, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare created Medicaid expansion in 2012, I think. And we are one of, I think, 11 states that hasn't expanded yet, but it might actually happen this year.
So where does that legislation stand this session?
So the House has passed a version of it that would expand Medicaid. The Senate will probably, but they passed a version last year that passed in Medicaid expansion, but also had a whole bunch of regulatory reforms. So we have a bunch of laws right now that limit competition primarily among hospitals, but also limit the number of like imaging centers, things that make money in healthcare. You have to get state permission. So the idea is, well, let's roll back some of those rules or all of those rules. That's what the Senate wants to do. Hospitals don't like that. The House has backed hospitals. So it's this battle between the House, which wants to expand Medicaid and just expand Medicaid, and the Senate that wants to expand Medicaid, but also change the way we regulate healthcare fundamentally in this state. And that's the back and forth right now. And I don't know how or when they're going to come to an agreement on that.
So moving, but there's a long way to go still.
I think the smart money is on Medicaid expansion passes this year.
Well, maybe.
All right. Okay. Maybe don't bet on it.
It's a tough one.
We'll talk about gambling later in the show.
Right.
So another healthcare issue, medical marijuana. Talked about for years. Last year got a little traction, but then went away. I think a lot of people are surprised it's even gotten this far in our state. Where does this stand now?
I was shocked it even showed up. I mean, I didn't expect to see this for another decade when it came out last year, but it came out with the backing of a very influential Senator Bill Rabin. He's the head of the Rules Committee. He's also a cancer survivor and somebody who has gone through some really difficult times health-wise, radiation, the treatment, chemo. And so he introduced this bill, and it made it through the Senate last year. And it appears to be, all signs are it will make it through the Senate again this year. There's been very little actual debate among lawmakers about it. But then it has to head for the House, and that's the big question. Because last year, there simply wasn't enough support for it in the House, so it never really got much of a hearing. But we've had a lot of turnover. A lot of folks who were among the staunchest opponents of it have left the House, have retired. And so we've got some new faces in, so it's, it might just be able to get through this year. So,
but even some supporters, I understand, have reservations about how the bill is written.
Yeah, it's always the devil is in the details. That's, a saying for a reason. And one of the concerns here is it only creates so many licenses and only allows so many locations to sell medical marijuana, and it only allows it for so many diseases. There's a list of like 12 different things that you can have it prescribed for, and then it creates a board that can expand that list going forward. But the real concern is that this is only going to help out-of-state companies, big cannabis, if you will. The way the rules are written, you have to have experience that by law you haven't been able to have in North Carolina because it's illegal.
You also have to have like vertical distribution. I mean, basically seed, they call it seed to sale.
Right.
So you have to be able to do everything from growing it to selling it. And we simply haven't allowed any business in North Carolina to have the capacity to do that.
So the thinking is that this will just help out-of-state companies come in, get a nexus here, and then shut out smaller dispensaries that want to do it.
So local hemp dealers have grown phenomenally over the past few years, and I know they're interested in getting involved, but they feel like they might get locked out of this one?
That's exactly right. Hemp, the non-intoxicating cousin of the marijuana plant, is legal, and there are farmers who grow it here. There are people who sell it here for various uses, and they sure would like to add marijuana because they would make a lot more money.
All right, let's shift to the budget. We have a couple minutes left in this segment. This is the long session. This is when we write the budget for the next 2 years. What are some of the priorities, and what are we looking at in terms of the surplus?
You're definitely going to see there's a surplus, a big one, first of all. I mean, it's just billions and billions of dollars more than we expected. You're going to see significant raises for teachers and for state employees. Now, the word significant,
yeah.
That means different things to different people.
Yeah.
But state lawmakers have realized, have acknowledged that we have a hiring problem. We have high vacancy rates. They're going to address that in some way. You're also almost certainly going to see additional tax cuts, and I mean beyond. They passed in the last couple of years tax cuts that kind of go out for 4 or 5 years, and they're already on the books for the next several years. You're going to see additional tax cuts beyond that, almost certainly. What that exactly will look like, I don't know. The House and Senate will have to negotiate over it.
And again, in terms of those priorities, is this something we're going to be talking about for months and months, because that's why they call it the long session?
Very likely. And again, I always contend that it actually takes longer if you have more money. When it's cuts, you kind of, you can cut what you can cut, but when you have extra money, that's what takes people a while to make their minds up about. And so that extra $3.2 billion in the surplus, it's hard to say where that's going to end up. Probably some of it will go to the rainy day fund, I would expect. That's what they've been doing with surplus money, a lot of it for the past few sessions.
They'll cut some taxes, they'll raise some salaries, and they'll save some money on the bottom line.
And quickly, the political makeup, very close to veto proof, but not quite there. I mean, how's that going to play into, let's say, the budget?
Well, we're watching very carefully to see which it's the House that is one vote short of a veto override. And there are a few Democrats that have been working with Republican leadership, and they've been given co-chairmanships or chairmanships in committees. So we're keeping an eye on them very carefully to see how they're voting on bills, what they're sponsoring, and to get maybe a sense of areas where they might be willing to override the veto on a given issue.
Excellent. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some gun legislation, very controversial at the General Assembly. We're also going to explore what's happening in terms of holes in our state workforce. Stay with us. And welcome back. We're talking about all kinds of state government issues, and joining the discussion now is WRAL's PolitiFact reporter, Paul Spey, who also covers state government, along with our Laura Leslie. And Paul, I want to talk about some of your recent reporting in regards to these huge vacancies we're seeing right now in state government. I mean, North Carolina is an incredibly fast-growing state, and yet you're reporting that we have 20 state agencies that are seeing their highest vacancy rate in years. What's causing this?
Right. Well, the first thing to think about is burnout. You know, oftentimes we think about government being this large entity run by people in suits, right? But there's a human element here too. A lot of the vacancies that we're seeing are in entry-level jobs that are physically or emotionally demanding. You know, on the physical side, working road construction, things like that. On the emotional side, we're seeing vacancies in like the juvenile justice division, people who work with juveniles. And then even, you know, at the DMV, they're having trouble finding clerks to work with the public. And so I think what started all this was the pandemic, right? Coronavirus hits and a lot of people go home or are sent home and they have time to think, well, my job's demanding. Do I want to risk illness for my current job? And for a lot of them, the answer was no. No, I don't want to go back. And that brings up the second contributing factor, which is low pay. And that's what I think a lot of people would say would solve the problem is higher pay. But during the pandemic, they realized they can find comparable pay in jobs that aren't as physically or emotionally draining. And so that's what a lot of people are doing. And department heads and managers are going to lawmakers this budget season and saying, hey, we need some help, whether it's recruiting or whether it's expanding how much money we're allowed to give people, give us more flexibility with bonuses, things like that. And it'll be interesting to see how much flexibility they do give them in these next couple of years. So
what's the impact for taxpayers in terms of the services they provide, and you know what are they going to end up paying for as we're in this slump, so to speak?
Well, right now, a lot of the agency leaders told us that you're not seeing the backups just yet. You might see one thing that a lot of people will see is at the DMV, it might take months to get an appointment.
I took my mom an hour to get somebody on the phone there. So yeah,
it's tough.
A lot of other agencies are stretched thin too, like Highway Patrol. They said right now our roads are safe, but there have been times where they've had a trooper out giving a presentation at a school or at an office about traffic safety, and they realize there's a hole, and they have to call them back from that presentation to get on the road just to make sure everyone's covered. So they're stretched thin, and the most alarming number in all this, I think, is not just the vacancies, but the HR leader for our state told us that in the next 5 years, 26% of state government employees will be eligible for full retirement benefits. So think about that. They're stretched thin now, and in the next 5 years, it could get even worse with this brain drain from people leaving that have been there a really long time.
And you're talking about entry-level positions. Are these positions that younger people might be able to step into without experience, or do they still need some sort of training?
That's right. In some cases it is. I mentioned Department of Transportation. They're starting a new recruitment tool new recruitment program, I should say, where they go to high schools. And it'll start this summer, and I think in about 50 districts. And they're going to try to get people on board with construction jobs, transportation jobs, They don't know the details just yet, but they're trying to go around the problem in that case and going directly to people who aren't even in the workforce yet.
But there is one area we should mention where you would need training, and that is healthcare.
Right.
And we have huge absences, huge vacancies in DHHS and in some of the group homes and hospitals and mental care facilities. And those are, a lot of those problems are industry-wide. I mean, there's a shortage of nurses at pretty much anywhere you go. But you can imagine at state rates, a nurse or a doctor or somebody can certainly make a lot more money in the private sector. And so they're having a lot of trouble staffing those positions on a permanent basis.
Let's transition to some controversial topics. Gun rights, always very controversial, of course. This past month, we've been reporting on more mass shootings, more school shootings, and yet now we've got state lawmakers who are moving a bill that would make it easier to buy and carry at least certain types of guns. Talk about that piece of legislation.
Yeah, so this goes back to what's known as the pistol permit. So you have to, in North Carolina, you have to get a pistol purchase permit if you want to buy a handgun. You got to go to your sheriff. They do a background check. They look for any mental involuntary commitments, for example, and your moral character, which they can also may just add up to how many times they've been called out to your house for domestic disturbance, right? And they decide whether or not to give you the gun. And the vast majority of the time, they do give people the permit, but in some cases they don't if the person has mental health problems or, Well, lawmakers want to get rid of that county level check because they say that the federal check, the NICS system, is actually doing a good enough job. It's been upgraded. It now has more mental health information in it. So they say, well, the federal check is enough. You shouldn't have to go through 2 layers to exercise your Second Amendment right. But there's a couple issues there. One is that there's no background check required for individual sales. So if I wanted to sell you one, I could certainly ask you to do a background check, but I'm not required to do that. And then the other thing has to do with domestic violence. And this goes back to North Carolina law, which is kind of weird. We don't have a domestic violence crime. We have people who commit domestic violence are charged with assault, right? And so assault by itself in the system is not flagged in NICS, because NICS is looking for domestic violence, and our crime doesn't say domestic violence. So that's where you end up with a loophole that could end up with a lot of people who are, convicted of domestic violence managing to get a gun anyway.
And this bill would also open up carrying onto school grounds when it's used for religious purposes. Is that right?
Right, and this is something that Republicans have been trying to do for a while. Their concern is, we've seen a lot of church shootings around the country, and they say that people at churches on private property are able to bring guns and they're able to protect themselves, but they say people in churches that meet on a property where there's a school present, for example, any church that has a school, they can't protect themselves. And so they say they should have the same right to do that. Now, people who are concerned about the people maybe leaving guns in a facility that's used as a school, and that's the big concern. And the governor has vetoed this several times, but this year they may be able to override.
Quickly, we have about 30 seconds in this segment. Anti-critical race theory legislation just surfaced again, got vetoed last session. What's the status?
It's the march of the zombie bills. There's a lot of bills that were vetoed in the last session and last few years, actually, and legislators are bringing them back because they see this as an opportunity to get them stacked up. Maybe they get the right day with the right mix of lawmakers, they can override and they can just run them through.
Excellent. Thank you both for your time. When we return, we're going to talk about North Carolina edging closer and closer to legalized sports betting anytime, any place. Stay with us. Welcome back. A few weeks ago, On the Record hosted a roundtable discussion with some lawmakers on the prospects of widespread legalized sports betting in North Carolina. WRAL's investigative sports reporter Brian Murphy has covered this topic extensively, watching both North Carolina and some other states. At the recording of this, we're expecting this bill to drop at any point. You've actually seen the draft legislation.
I've seen some draft legislation, and supporters are doubling down. This is the same bill that got voted down last year in the House. All the changes have been incorporated into one bill, and that should be filed sometime shortly. We'll be hearing a lot of debate about that. That means college sports gambling is back in the bill. That means you can use a credit card to fund your accounts, and that means the distribution that goes to all counties, as well as several HBCU athletic departments, is still in this bill.
So the makeup of the legislature since last session has changed somewhat. Does that favor this type of legislation or not?
Supporters say it does. I mean, we're not talking about somewhat. We're talking about almost 25% of the legislature has turned over. The Senate, many House members have moved up to the Senate. A lot of them are very supportive, and the people who have backfilled in the House are more supportive than they were last year. Also, there were a couple of key absences last year that really led to the bill going down. I think supporters are very, very optimistic.
Last time we talked, a big issue was who's going to get the licenses. Has that changed at all in the legislation?
The bill and the copy that I've seen would keep it the same. So the sports teams would not get allocated their specific licenses. They could compete for them, but they would have to team up with an operator.
In regards to the debate, the opposition, obviously, at the last minute, they took colleges out, and that's a big. The fact that we're starting so early in the session, potentially, where do you see the debate headed?
I mean, I think we're going to hear a lot about this, right? Sports gambling has exploded across the country, and we're seeing a lot of people concerned about problem gambling, about addiction, about what's happening to teens in particular or young men in particular. But we're also seeing Georgia, Texas, Kentucky, Missouri, Vermont, just to name a few, are debating bills of this exact nature in their states. So that I think people are aware of some of the problems, but they're also seeing other states making a lot of money off of this, and some of their citizens saying, "Hey, I want to do this in our state." So it's a push and pull.
So where do we stand right now in terms of states that have actually approved it and those that are debating it right now?
Yeah, Massachusetts has approved it and will start in March. Those 5 states that I mentioned are debating it right now. We're at about half and half. About half the states in the country have approved mobile gambling, and half are in North Carolina's position where they have not yet approved it.
Clearly hasn't passed, hasn't really come up for a formal debate yet, but what about the timing? For those people watching this that are just hankering to start placing some legal bets.
Yeah, again, I think we're looking at next Super Bowl. That should be the benchmark. If you're thinking about wanting to place a wager, next Super Bowl should be about the time that everything is put together. If this passes this session, now, no guarantee. I'm not guaranteeing anything on this program, but if it does pass, I think we're looking at rolling out next February.
So in terms of these other states, are they going down the same road? Are there different variations? What are you seeing in your reporting on other states?
Yeah, the bills are so varied. Some states are allocating licenses to their professional sports team or their racetracks or other in-state businesses. Some are allowing in-person gambling, like North Carolina does at 3 locations, but tightening up on mobile gambling. Others are opening it wide open and we'll be able to have between 10 and 12 operators. Other states have 20 to 25 operators. So the states really are experimenting with different approaches.
And we're not there yet, but in terms of the landscape, if people wanted to vote once we get there, how would they do it?
How would they bet?
Yeah, not vote.
They'd be able to bet on their mobile device, on your cell phone. And that's one worry of people who say, cell phones are already very addicting. Now you're adding another addicting habit on top of that. But you'd be able to create an account with one of these operators, FanDuel, DraftKings. I'm sure you've heard of a dozen of these. You'd be able to fund that with your credit card, and you'd be able to gamble within minutes of that.
College sports, pro sports.
College sports, pro sports, likely the World Cup, events like that. Golf, almost no limit to what you'd be able to gamble on.
All right, Brian, as always, thanks for your reporting, and I know we'll be checking back with you on this. All right, if you have something to say about tonight's discussion, you can follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/WRAL, or you can email us your comments, questions, criticism on the record at WRAL.com, and you can always write us a letter. Do snail mail on the record at P.O. Box 12,000, Raleigh 27605. I want to thank our NC Capital team for helping me out tonight. Also, thank you for watching and pay attention to what's going on in your state government. Have a great night.